There's a block of stone sitting on a wind-scoured plateau in Bolivia, almost 13,000 feet above sea level, and when engineers finally pointed a 3D scanner at it, the data made some of them go quiet. Not because of a ghost story. Because of the numbers. Flat surfaces holding tolerances you'd expect from a machine shop. Interior corners that shouldn't be possible with the tools the site is supposed to have been built with. A pattern repeating across separate blocks with a precision that looks less like craftsmanship and more like a specification. Stay with me, because by the end of this you're going to look at a Bronze Age ruin completely differently, and you're going to understand exactly why archaeologists themselves keep arguing about this place. Let's start with where we are. Puma Punku sits at the edge of the ancient city of Tiwanaku, near the southern shore of Lake Titicaca, on Bolivia's Altiplano, a flat, treeless, oxygen-starved plateau, where the air holds around 40 less oxygen than sea level, and nighttime temperatures can drop below freezing even in the growing season. Nothing about this location makes large-scale construction easy. There's little timber for scaffolding or rollers. Farming is hard. And yet, sometime between roughly 500 and 1000 CE, the people who lived here built one of the most technically ambitious stone complexes anywhere in the ancient Americas. The scale alone is worth sitting with. Some of the sandstone blocks used in Puma Punku's platforms are estimated to weigh well over 100 tons. The largest surveyed block comes in at around 130 metric tons. That's heavier than a loaded freight locomotive. The sandstone appears to have come from a quarry roughly 10 kilometers away. A harder volcanic stone called andesite, used for the finer carved elements, likely came from even farther, possibly from the Copacabana Peninsula across the lake. Moving stones like that, without wheeled vehicles or draft animals suited to the load, using ramps, log rollers, ropes, and enormous numbers of laborers, was almost certainly one of the great engineering feats of the pre-Columbian world. Archaeologists don't dispute that it was hard. They dispute how it's often described afterward. Because here's where the story usually gets exaggerated, and I want to be straight with you about it. The sandstone is workable rock. It's not granite. It responds to abrasion and to harder stone hammers. The andesite is a different matter. It's a fine-grained volcanic rock, harder than the sandstone, and it's the andesite that produces Puma Punku's most famous feature, a set of stones carved into a nearly identical stepped, notched profile that researchers nicknamed the H-blocks. Lay two of them side by side and the resemblance is startling. Multiple H-blocks share the same recessed channels, the same drilled points, the same stepped edges, repeated across separate pieces of stone. That repetition is the real mystery here, and it's a genuine one, not a manufactured one. A single mason, working entirely by eye and hand, tends to produce variation from piece to piece. Human work has a signature, small asymmetries, slightly different depths, corners that drift. What researchers who've studied and scanned the H-blocks have found instead is a level of consistency between separate stones that looks deliberate, evidence of a shared template, a standard the builders were working toward, whether that meant a physical measuring cord, a wooden pattern block, or simply an extremely disciplined and well-trained specialist workforce reproducing the same design over and over. We don't have direct evidence of what that template was, because organic materials like wood, cord, and hide rarely survive 1,000+ years on an exposed high-altitude plateau. Their absence isn't proof they didn't exist, it's an artifact of what does and doesn't preserve. Now let's talk about the tools, because this is where a lot of dramatic claims get made that don't hold up well against what's actually been recovered. The Tiwanaku culture worked in stone, bone, and wood, and also in metal. Excavations at Tiwanaku and related sites have recovered bronze and copper alloy tools, including alloys hardened with arsenic or tin, along with clamps used to bind stone blocks together, some of which still show tool marks in the channels cut for them. Andean metallurgy by this period was genuinely sophisticated. The idea that the builders had nothing but stone hammers and bare hands is a simplification that shows up constantly online, but doesn't match the excavation record. Combine harder stone hammerstones for roughing out shapes, bronze tools for finer work, and then patient abrasive grinding with wet sand for the final flat surfaces and sharp interior angles, and you get a toolkit that's fully capable, over enough time, with enough skilled labor, of producing what we see at Puma Punku. It's slow. It's demanding. It requires real expertise passed down through generations of specialists. But slow and demanding is not the same thing as physically impossible. So what did the modern 3D scanning actually add to this picture? This part is real and it's worth understanding clearly, without the exaggeration. Teams using laser scanning and photogrammetry, the same category of technology used to inspect machined aerospace parts, have built highly detailed digital models of several Puma Punku blocks, capturing surface geometry down to fractions of a millimeter. What that data shows is exactly what field archaeologists had already observed with calipers and straight edges for decades: flat interior faces on the andesite blocks, consistent drilled hole spacing along certain grooves, and matching profiles between separate H-blocks. The scanning didn't overturn the archaeological understanding of the site, it confirmed it, in far more precise and shareable digital form, which is genuinely useful for research and conservation. It also documents something sobering: the site is actively eroding. Freeze-thaw cycling, wind-driven grit, groundwater salts, and constant foot traffic are gradually softening the very edges and corners that make this stonework so distinctive. Some of the researchers doing this scanning work are explicit that a major motivation is simply archival, capturing the geometry now, before more of it weathers away. Here's the part where I have to push back on the version of this story that tends to go viral. You'll often hear that these scans reveal corners no tool could have cut, or drilling no ancient culture could have achieved, implying the work of some unidentified, technologically advanced group, sometimes framed outright as extraterrestrial, or a lost pre-human civilization. That claim isn't supported by the evidence. Tightly radiused interior corners and clean drilled points are difficult to produce by hand, but they are not physically impossible with graduated abrasive techniques, hardened metal tooling, and enormous investments of skilled labor and time, methods well attested in other high-precision stoneworking traditions around the ancient world, from Old Kingdom Egypt to later Andean sites. Difficulty is not the same as impossibility, and I can't picture how they did this by hand is a statement about our imagination, not a measurement of the stone. It's also worth being honest about the oral traditions that often get folded into this story. Spanish chroniclers in the 16th century did record local Andean accounts describing Tiwanaku and Puma Punku as already ancient and abandoned by the time of the Inca, sometimes attributing their construction to a distant, almost mythic past. That's a genuinely fascinating piece of cultural history. It tells us something about how later Andean peoples related to a monument whose builders' direct descendants and detailed building knowledge had, by then, been lost to time, political upheaval, and the same centuries of erosion visible in the stone itself. But origin myths recorded by outsiders, filtered through translation and centuries, are not archaeological dating evidence, and treating them as proof of a hidden prehistoric or non-human builder misrepresents both the sources and the culture that produced them. The dating itself, by the way, isn't based on guesswork or vibes. Radiocarbon dating of organic material from Tiwanaku period contexts, along with stratigraphy and comparison with the broader Tiwanaku civilization's rise and decline, places the main construction phases of Puma Punku roughly in the mid-1st millennium CE, with the site reaching its architectural peak before Tiwanaku's decline around 1000 CE. There was an early 20th century researcher, Arthur Poznansky, who argued for a far older date, tens of thousands of years, based on archaeoastronomical alignments. His extreme chronology has been rejected by virtually every archaeologist who has examined it since, largely because the astronomical assumptions underlying it don't hold up, and because they contradict a large, consistent body of dating evidence from the wider region. That rejection is often misrepresented online as scholars silencing an inconvenient discovery. It's more accurate to say his conclusions didn't survive scrutiny, which is exactly how science, including archaeology, is supposed to work. None of this makes Puma Punku less remarkable. If anything, I think the real story is more impressive than the mythologized one, because it's a story about people. About a highland civilization with no wheeled transport, and no large draft animals figuring out how to quarry, move, and finish stone at a scale and precision that still challenges engineers today, using ingenuity, organization, and generations of accumulated skill instead of machines. The comparison worth making isn't Puma Punku versus ancient aliens, it's Puma Punku versus the later Inca stonework at sites like Cusco and Ollantaytambo, built by a culture we know an enormous amount about. Inca masonry is famous for regular, polygonal blocks individually fitted together with knife blade tightness, each stone unique, shaped to its specific neighbors. Puma Punku's andesite work looks different, modular, standardized, repeating. That's a real and interesting contrast, and archaeologists do discuss it, not as evidence of two different species of builder, but as evidence of two different building traditions, separated by centuries, serving different architectural purposes, developed by cultures with different tools, priorities, and labor systems. So where does that leave us? Puma Punku is not a hoax, and it's not an unsolved impossibility waiting for a more exotic explanation. It's a genuinely world-class piece of ancient engineering, built by the Tiwanaku civilization using a combination of stone, bronze, and abrasive tools, organized skilled labor, and a level of standardization that still isn't fully explained in terms of exactly how the templates or measuring systems worked, because the organic materials that would answer that question didn't survive 1,000 years on an exposed Andean plateau. That's a real gap in the evidence. It's just not evidence of the fantastical. The honest position isn't therefore it must have been someone or something else. It's there's more here we'd like to know, and every year, wind and freeze-thaw cycles erase a little more of the answer, which is exactly why the 3D scanning work happening at the site right now matters so much. It's not proving a conspiracy. It's racing the weather to preserve the last physical evidence of exactly how skilled the people who built this place really were. If you want to keep going down this road with me, tell me in the comments where to point the scanner next, Cusco's polygonal walls, the megalithic platform at Sacsayhuaman, or the quarry marks at Ollantaytambo, where you can actually see unfinished blocks still sitting exactly where the builders left them. That's where this story gets even more interesting, because unlike Puma Punku, some of those sites still have the unfinished work in place, the closest thing we have to catching an ancient stoneworking crew in the act.